Good afternoon. I also want to extend my thanks to Chris and our hosts for this wonderful conference that we've had the last 2 days. And I look forward to the rest of it, so thank you. I need to begin with a confession. I feel a little bit like an imposter at this conference. You see, disciples weren't around at the founding of the United States. The earliest we can responsibly trace our history back to is 1801, a full 25 years after 1776. So what could I possibly have to say, and what artifact could I possibly choose to make sense to share with you all? To the first question about having something to say, let me try this. The disciples of Christ, though not present at the founding, were born of it. The democratic ethos of the young nation was the soil in which disciples emerged, in both the movements centered around Barton Stone, whom I'm not going to talk about today, and the Campbells, Thomas and Alexander. Democratic political forms shaped their organization and activity, and the ideal of freedom occupied their religious imaginations. In many ways, disciples, I'm going to contend, were an early 19th century experiment in religious liberty of a particular American form. My emphasis here on freedom in the founding generation of disciples is not how disciples' history is typically told. Most know disciples as a movement that sought two things: Christian unity and restoration. That is, a return to the simple and plain teachings of the New Testament church as the mechanism for uniting all Christians. These two ideals stood at the heart of 19th century disciples' identity. But we might consider the movement's rootedness in American liberty as a kind of third pillar, and one which I think helps to illuminate its birth and formation within the democratic ethos of the young nation, as historian Nathan Hatch has described a couple decades ago. It also gives me a reason to be here and to speak and to be with you all. As for the artifact, I'm sharing one of the founding documents for disciples, albeit not our earliest founding document. What I've brought is the Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington, written and published in 1809 by the recently immigrated Thomas Campbell, the father of Alexander Campbell, whom you might be more familiar with. There are 6 extant copies of the original published Declaration of Address, and the original we are in the process of acquiring actually predates all 6 of those. It is the galley copy that the publisher in Washington, Pennsylvania, issued to Thomas Campbell, and on which he made edits that are reflected in the original publication, which in itself is pretty cool, right? But it gets even more interesting because a few decades later, Thomas's son Alexander was writing his father's biography and made some of his own marginal notes on the manuscript. So the version includes the pre-published edits of the founding father and later the notes of the founding son. And you can see here the title page and the first page of the declaration of the galley copy. Our archivists at the Disciples of Christ Historical Society don't trust me to travel with any originals. So what I have here is the 1908 facsimile pictured here on the screen, which I am actually going to try to pass around if it's possible. Somebody just keep track of it so I can get it back. This copy was made in advance of the celebration of the centennial of the publication, so for 1909. This particular facsimile, which is printing number 10 in a limited series of the centennial version, is part of my personal library, although we have another in the collection, which again, our archivists won't let me, don't trust me to travel with that one either. So, but why this artifact? The Declaration and Address. Why is it significant historically? The major argument of Thomas Campbell in the Declaration and Address is his conviction that the grand design of the Christian religion is to reconcile people to God and to one another. Hence the central focus on Christian unity, which was central and personal for Thomas, having immigrated from Ireland, where he'd witnessed religion division and violence. Upon arriving in the U.S., the presbytery in southwestern Pennsylvania called Thomas and sent him out to preach, where he ministered to many people on the frontier who did not have churches of their own denomination nearby. Campbell's ecumenical spirit and his ministry led to trouble with other ministers within the presbytery. After several months of contention and hearings, Thomas withdrew his connection to the Associate Reformed Synod. Yet he still found many opportunities to preach, and he quickly attracted a following of like-minded folks who embraced his emphasis on Christian unity, and who eventually together formed the Christian Association of Washington, modeled on the Evangelical Society of Ulster, which Thomas had associated with in Northern Ireland. The association was not intended to be a separate denomination or even church, but rather a multi-denominational group of individuals concerned about the divisions within Protestant Christianity and committed to promoting Christian unity. With the association formed, Thomas set out to write its statement of purpose, which took the form of a manifesto for Christian unity and freedom. The Declaration and Address of the Christian Association of Washington, in this sense, should be read, I think, as mirroring the Declaration of Independence, at least the Declaration section of it. What I want to suggest and underscore is the thematic resonances between the Declaration and Address and the Declaration of Independence here, particularly the analogical relation between political or civil freedom and religious freedom, while being careful not to equate the two. Thomas, and later his son Alexander, declared freedom from religious tyranny and freedom for religious self-determination for the people of God. The Declaration and Address, we should have this quote. There's Thomas Campbell, joyful-looking fellow. But he declares in the Declaration and Address, awake, awake. Sorry. Put on thy strength, O Zion. Put on thy beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city. Shake thyself from the dust, O Jerusalem. Arise, loose thyself from the bands of thy neck, O captive daughter of Zion. Resume that precious, that dear-bought liberty wherewith Christ has made his people free, a liberty from subjection to any authority but his own in matters of religion. Call no man father, no man master upon earth, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. Stand fast, therefore, in the precious liberty, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. For the vindication of this precious liberty have we declared ourselves hearty and willing advocates. Although Campbell's emphasis on the authority of Christ in this particular excerpt may not sound like the language of liberation you might associate with the founding era, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Kidd's lecture last night, which helped me better understand religion within the imagination of the founders. But this appeal to Christ's authority is different. And yet his primarily Scotch-Irish immigrant followers would have heard awakened echoes of heroic tales about their Scottish ancestors. To them, setting Christ on his throne meant repudiation of all earthly rule, ecclesiastical or civil. And this was a mandate for freedom in both the realms of politics and religion. Divine sovereignty and Christian liberty were two sides of the same coin. Eventually, disciples would adopt a 17th century slogan to capture Campbell's position here. In essentials, unity; in opinions, liberty; and in all things, charity. For disciples in the decades following America's founding, their situation in the young nation offered what felt like a heaven-sent opportunity to start anew, in religion, in government, and in the pursuit of happiness. In the Declaration and Address, Thomas speaks about this in glowing terms as a thorough reformation of all things civil and religious, in the following passage, where he draws a direct line connecting freedom of the church with freedom in the state. And I should note or warn you that perceptive listeners will catch Thomas's anti-Catholicism that pops up throughout this manifesto. The favorable opportunity which divine providence has put into your hands in this happy country for the accomplishment of so great a good is a consideration of no small encouragement. A country happily exempted from the baneful influence of a civil establishment of any peculiar form of Christianity, from under the direct influence of the anti-Christian hierarchy, and at the same time from any formal connection with the devoted nations that have given their strength and power unto the beast, in which, of course, no adequate reformation can be accomplished until the word of God is fulfilled and the vials of his wrath poured out upon them. Can the Lord expect or require anything less from a people in such unhampered circumstances, from a people so liberally furnished with all means and mercies, than a thorough reformation in all things civil and religious, according to his work? Thomas Campbell's Declaration and Address reads as a kind of manifesto declaring that in America, Christians are freed from ecclesiastical control and freed for reunification or reconciliation with God and with other Christians. This reconciliation would require a recovery or a return to what Campbell termed the simple evangelical Christianity of the early church, also referred to as primitive Christianity. For Campbell and for early disciples, religious liberty and restorationism were necessarily bound one to another. As I get toward the end here, let me say a little bit about the place of restorationism in the Declaration and Address and for early disciples in relation to the founding of America, which I think will help illuminate why I would characterize the early disciples as an experiment in liberty. Walt Whitman's poem, O Pioneers, captures well the feeling of many in the decades following the founding. All the past we leave behind, we embark upon a new, mightier world. Alongside this sense of a new world taking shape in America was a corresponding desire for recovery, a return to something ancient and pure. They were looking for what religion scholar Mircea Eliade called sacred time, the time of the gods, as opposed to the profane time of human history. This was true within the political realm. Delegates to the Constitutional Convention didn't necessarily look to recent political history for guidance, but to the classical world in seeking to connect to something universal. It is instructive that they were trying to form a government that honored the rights of man rather than, say, the rights of Englishmen. And in the realm of religion, the same impulse to recover the sacred past shaped several movements, including existing groups like Baptists, new groups like the Shakers. But the two groups most taken by projects of restoration were disciples and Mormons. Now, I won't dive into what it meant for Mormons right now, but for disciples, the primitive impulse was directed at the early church because of its proximity to the incarnation, the inbreaking of sacred time. They perceived the simple teachings and practices of the early church as undefiled by human-imposed traditions and creeds. If Christians would return to the model of the primitive church, embracing their liberation from the creeds and clerics of the old world, then Christians would be reconciled one to another. Simple as that. Thomas, as well as his son Alexander, was inspired by the American experiment. They saw in its founding and its democracy just the sort of government God intended, one in which Christian union could be realized. In my opinion, the religious formation, reformation they were leading, and the new venture of the United States were, at least in this historian's opinion, parallel and compatible experiments in liberty. And in conclusion, I need to qualify everything that I've just said if I'm going to be responsible as a historian. I've spoken descriptively about the Declaration of Address and positively about the role of liberty in the early history of disciples, but that freedom that they talked about had limits. Some disciples could not imagine that same freedom, political or religious, extending to enslaved African Americans, for example. The disciples' experiment in religious liberty does not float above that history. It is entangled with race, racism, and settler colonialism. And I also feel the need to state here at the close that their treatment and optimism about the American experiment, especially as developed in the later thought of Alexander, planted the seeds for a kind of proto-Christian nationalism that leaves me feeling uncomfortable. And I'm pretty sure Thomas and Alexander and Barton Stone would have been uncomfortable with as well. But here's what I hope you'll take away. We would do well to remember that those who responded to the plea of the Declaration and Address were daughters and sons of the Revolution. They believed both experiments in liberty were consistent, that both represented the purposes of God, and they gave their hearts both to the nation and the restored church with little sense of strain between the two, for better and for worse. Thank you.